because I don't see them as two different things, that Gnosis inspires art or that art inspires Gnosis. I see them as like rivers downstream of a sort of a conceptual glacier that's feeding both.
You're listening to Talks from the Apostolic Johannite Church.
My name is Sean McCann, and I currently serve as the Patriarch of the Apostolic Johannite Church. But I also serve as the local priest for the parish of St. Joseph of Arimathea in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And twice a month we get together and we meet, we have mass, and we have discussion, and it usually involves a lot of food and bad humor. And often I've found over the years that when we have these discussions on Gnosticism and spirituality, that a lot of gems seem to drop out. So I decided that we were overdue to have a conversation in this format that replicates, or rather continues, some of the conversations that we've had around the parish table. And probably the longest standing conversations I've had is with our most regular and longest attending and longest suffering parishioner, Jason Mehmel. So I've invited Jason Mehmel to come have a talk about Gnosticism, Gnosis, and art, because I think he's uniquely positioned to talk about some of those subjects. And I think it's also a subject that's near and dear to the heart of many Gnostics, Johannites, and esotericists around the planet. So welcome, Jason.
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah.
Interesting to encounter you in a environment that doesn't involve meat.
I know.
It's probably healthier for us. Why don't you? I mean, you and I have now been talking probably for the last decade at least.
12 years, I think.
Yeah, well, I'm glad somebody's keeping track. That almost feels as long as my marriage. And so we've been having these conversations for a long time. So I feel that we kind of know each other very well. But of course, the folks at home may not know you as well, unless perhaps they participate in some of our stuff online. That said, why don't you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your journey?
Okay. Well, yeah. So again, I'm Jason Mehmel. I'm currently, I describe myself as a theater artist and a writer, a facilitator. I've done coaching now with TEDxYYC, and that's been really invigorating for me. But that's kind of sort of the present snapshot. I grew up in this part of the world in Alberta, in fact, just south of Calgary. And for quite a lot of my career and life, I've been involved in or fascinated by narrative and story, a voracious reader even as a child, moving then into first considering myself as a writer, and then the love I've had for theater has really invigorated me, and I went into training in theater and then proceeded to continue to work in theater, and now that's my full-time job, is running a theater company that does intimate work that really focuses on building empathy and community in its audience by introducing them to characters that are deeply outside of their experience, and by presenting an emerging artist festival that gives artists like I myself received about 12 years ago, or actually 16 years ago, an opportunity to work as an actor and as a director in ways that then boosted my career to the place where I am now. Maybe the only other thing to say that might sort of be germane here is I think that I've always found myself grappling with a sense of spiritualism that also I can reconcile to my aesthetic experience, or those things that drive me, those things where I feel like I've made a direct connection with something. And for me, that's something I've always found in art, but also through particularly nerdy directions. And maybe I might already kind of dive into why we're talking.
Nerd away. Be as nerdy as you like.
Well, great. So, yeah. So, like a lot of us, I think we encounter. I think Gnosticism is often something that people encounter these days, often through art or through fiction. There's works like obviously The Matrix and and like a lot of books, Philip K. Dick being a good example as well of these sort of vectors for Gnosticism to kind of to happen. And I think those I would experience the same as anybody. But the thing that really grabbed me in terms of Gnosticism as a thing to look at and to be a part of and to think about and to engage with was actually through a friend of mine running a game of Dungeons and Dragons. He decided to use the real Earth history as the setting for our game. And when we were trying to decide how to make magic work, he decided to use Gnostic concepts like the Demiurge and the Archons, and this idea of the world being something that is controlled, but that also in his usage of it that you could interact with. And that was sort of his way of explaining the magic from Dungeons and Dragons having a place in our real world. But the more he referenced this stuff, and this, I should mention, this friend of mine is, I think at the very least, an agnostic, if not an atheist. So he has no vested interest in this. He wasn't a practicing Gnostic that was spreading the word. He literally thought the mythology of it was cool when he took it in university as a history class. And I also thought it was cool enough to keep sort of Googling it and researching about it and listening to other podcasts and lectures and stuff like that. And literally Googling at one point Gnosticism in Calgary, Alberta, and coming across the Apostolic Johannite Church.
Well, I was going to say you took the next question right out of my mouth, which is how you came to Gnosticism, and certainly that origin story, as it were, is A, about as classically Gnostic as you can get, and B, about as nerdy as you can get. I spent a good portion of my teenage years, when I wasn't trying to ingest every substance around and play in a very bad band, playing role-playing games, and I quite enjoyed them. So that's not how I came to heresy, but it's you're almost kind of the poster child of don't let your kids play D&D or else they're going to go down the bad route, right?
That's until just this very moment, I don't think I'd ever put it together that way.
Well, I don't think I had thought about it. Like we've had this conversation a few times, and it just occurred to me that you just kind of proved their point. Play D&D, go down the dark path. So you came across the AJC by searching online for Gnosticism, and obviously at some point in time you walked in the door. But that, of course, doesn't. There's always a follow-up question. Hey, why did you come out, or what was this? What was interesting about this? But I find that some folks don't always ask the follow-up question of why did you keep doing it? Why did you stay?
Right. Well, and I think, honestly, it's because the meeting yourself and Lance at the time I was meeting people who took what they were talking about seriously, but not themselves. And I think that's a huge factor. And in fact, a lot of what I've encountered about Gnosticism elsewhere is, in fact, the opposite. People who are taking themselves too seriously, but the subject not enough. And that I think is exactly what I needed to see to keep me around, was that and we have debated over the last 12 years, or either debated or discussed the applicability or the usefulness of how the AJC does certain things. And I ask a lot of questions about why things are done.
A lot of questions.
But I'm never I'm never there to say that it shouldn't be done, but I'm more to help me understand. And the fact that was a conversation I could continue to have and have continued to have is, I think, a really, again, a great step in terms of being there. That I think the fact that the AJC has such a great way of having a thing that it knows it wants to do as an organization, but one that it never enforces in the sense of, this is the way you have to do it, and this is the interpretation you have to take. That to me is such a healthy intellectual space to be in. it's rigorous. Like everybody that I've met in the AJC has been somebody who I found that I respect in terms of their opinion and their ideas, and their willingness to engage on those ideas, versus sort of a received wisdom of like, this is what Gnosticism is. This is the only way that it works. And, you have to do it. Like, if you're not doing it this way, you're not doing Gnosticism. And I found the exact opposite of that. I found like very free thinking, but never frivolous thought in the AJC. And that's what keeps me around.
Well, I think the reality is creating, maintaining, and enforcing an orthodoxy is hard work. So when you look at some of the early stories, like the Church Fathers, who go willingly to martyrdom, I kind of get why. I think at that point I'd be ready to, take that step if I had to do the additional work of always making sure everybody was painting within the lines. And by the way, I was going to mention, speaking of taking what we do seriously but not ourselves seriously, we'd missed a fine opportunity to mention that we don't take Lance seriously. So Lance, if you're listening at home, that one's for you. So and the reality is you've had it coming. So I think the main thing here is, of course, there's a variety of people that come to Gnosticism that are involved with a variety or a varying of degrees. Some are very hardcore into the classical, almost semi-literal classical Gnosticism. Others are more about the overlapping concept of gnosis. So recognizing that we've kind of got a very diverse membership, in between the spaces of Gnosticism as a religion and gnosis as a concept, I kind of wanted to separate those out a bit and talk about them separately, because I think they've got their own significant interactions with the practice of art. Mm-hmm. So how do you see gnosis and art, whether it's music or theater, poetry, iconography, any of those kind of things? How do you see gnosis and art, the interplay of those things? Where do they overlap? Where do they clash? Where do they benefit from each other, I guess? Yeah. Sorry, that's a really convoluted question, but I trust that you get what I mean. How do you see gnosis and art?
Yeah, well, in some respects, I don't see them as separate things. Like, I think, again, I think I was speaking about the sort of the intellectual space around the AJC in terms of how the group that I've met, how everyone approaches the ideas and the different, like, there is a spectrum of approaches to Gnosticism within the AJC, and a respect for that spectrum of approaches. That's something that keeps me there, because of the like I was saying earlier, that intellectual rigor. But the other thing that keeps me at the AJC and keeps me as a Gnostic is literally that I until I had discovered Gnosticism, I hadn't found something that spoke to me about what it is like to create and experience art.
Interesting.
I feel like if we consider gnosis as a direct experiential contact with something spiritually, psychologically, extra dimensionally larger than ourselves, then I think that art is exactly that same thing in its maybe its most ideal form, or in its highest impact. It does that. There's a couple of things. So my own personal experience has been that when I'm working in theater, particularly, if I'm lucky and I'm doing my job right, there will be at least a moment, maybe only a handful of seconds, at some point in the story, where the audience and the actors and the crew and everyone in that space is breathing together. They're experiencing something that is beyond any one of them individually, and is connecting them to something larger than themselves. And that moment takes my breath away. And it's the rush of that I think keeps me making art. It's also, I think, closely connected to how I have heard experienced, how I've heard described rather the experience of gnosis. And so that's a big thing that keeps me there. Was that personal direct experience of something that felt so much larger than me. There's a quote by an author, Jeanette Winterson, a British writer. She talks about in a book rather. The book is called Art Objects, and the essay is also called Art Objects. And the essay starts with that she was walking in Paris, and she walked past a gallery, and she said, "I saw a painting that had more power to stop me than I had power to walk away." And that moment to me is such a great articulation about, if not the experience of what a Gnostic artistic experience is, if it is not directly describing the indescribable, it is describing the space around that indescribableness. Which is, again, I think something that I've found so much in what I've learned about Gnosis and art, is that there is no formula by which you can say that if you do the following things, the same things always happen around that impact. But what you can do is build an experience or build a space for an experience that if you build that space, something larger will arrive.
Well, that's something I think we've talked along similar lines about liturgy and ritual, creating a space where those things can occur.
Totally.
I guess if that would be a thing. Now, you in going through that, you actually inspired a follow-up question, because you said essentially that it was the closest analog to that type of experience. So off the cuff here, because I had a set of listed questions that I had written out prior to this, but off the cuff as a kind of follow-up question, when somebody who is creative and they're creating in their own space, whichever art it is, or one of many that they choose to engage in, when they hit that creative point, do you think they're, I guess, are they tapping into that same thing? Like I've often both around the parish dinner table and at conclaves and whatnot, describe gnosis as the subjective experience of objective spiritual truth. So I guess if somebody hits that point, their mojo, for lack of a better phrase, if somebody hits that point in either their act of creation or the act of sharing that creation, like theater that you referenced, do you think they're not tapping into a similar thing, but that they're tapping into the same thing, that there's actually a point where it becomes a bridge to the divine, to be frank?
Yeah. Well, I think yes, it's such a, there's so many questions that are baked into that question that are fascinating that I want to dig into. But just even when you were saying, is any artist working who is striving for or is connecting to that level of experience, are they tapping into the same thing? And I would say yes, by any way you could define or measure the kind of experience that's being provided. In also, I think that sense that none of us, no artist really is often creating in a full vacuum where they're just following a blind impulse. Like they're operating. I think you were saying, what is it? A subjective experience?
Subjective experience of objective spiritual truth or reality, I guess, as you were.
Yeah. So I think every artist is subjectively responding to an objective experience of human society, of the context of the culture around them, and the emotional and spiritual instincts that drive them. And I think those are the same thing, in the sense that any artist that is striving to make a connection is striving to make a connection within that gestalt, that total picture of human experience. And so yes, I think it's the same thing I get really specific on my definitions, which is why I really hum and haw when you ask me questions like this, because.
Well, I've got more coming up because you've inspired a follow-up question, but keep going.
Oh, great. Yeah. Like, one thing that I've really actually, so lately, especially in the last few years, I've really been thinking about when you were talking there about the subjective versus objective reality. And I think the one thing about that objective reality is that there is, that objective reality is so big and encompassing and broad and I don't know, I'm trying to find more words for this, complex maybe, that it is unrepresentable at full fidelity. So like no artistic work can fully represent what the reality truly is of the divine or of that gestalt of human experience or anything like that. All it can do is
this is also why we call it the ineffable, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it just, before we started the call, I loved how you described in a lot of ways what we're trying to do is F the ineffable, which is that's brilliant.
I wasn't sure if that would make it into the actual official conversation, but there we are.
I couldn't help it. It was too good. Yeah, no, I think that, but that is a big thing, is that I think artists are trying to take their subjective experience and that sliver of that experience that will point to a larger experience. And that larger experience is what we are all sort of striving for or connecting to, but that we are essentially as a meaning making, language using organism, attempting to use these tools that are by their nature insufficient for the task, and that the best we can do with these tools is to try to use them not as an attempt to fully capture it, but as an attempt to bootstrap the consciousness of that other person we're connecting to, be it an audience member or a person viewing a painting or watching a movie or a reader. We're trying to bootstrap that consciousness to a similar aha moment, a similar ineffable, indescribable moment that all our art did was create a frame enough that you could see through it towards that ineffable moment.
See, you're not leading me away from my follow-up question. You're kind of running towards it. So with those excellent thoughts, I'm gonna throw it at you. Now we know, and I mean, the next question I have is around Gnosticism as a religion and philosophy itself. So I don't want to jump the gun on that. But we do know that Gnosis as a concept, and where it has overlap with esotericism, the occult, various other traditions like the Kabbalah, Hermeticism, and whatnot. We know historically that these things tend to rise and fall and get suppressed. Specifically, when you look at the history of Gnosticism, of course, you have a history of rise and falls. You have the original classical Gnostics, getting the boot several times in the, I guess, apostolic era of Christian history, in terms of Gnosticism as a Christian heresy. And then you have it, of course, resurged later with movements like the Bogomils and the Cathars coming up in the high Middle Ages. And then, of course, again, with things like the occult revival in France and Martinism and whatnot in the 18th, 19th centuries. So things tend to go underground and tend to spring up sometimes with no historical connection to each other. It seems that these movements that have much in common with each other don't always have a connection to each other. So what I wanted to follow up on that is, do you think art is a kind of tool for digging into the ground and striking the underground stream of gnosis, if that makes sense? That if Gnosticism or gnosis as a concept were to disappear from the face of the earth, that it would be possible for art to pull it up from the ground?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think it's, well, because again, I think like one of the earlier things I said in our conversation is that is not seeing gnosis and art, or I shouldn't say gnosis and art, but gnosis and the experience of art, or the artistic experience, is maybe a closer way of saying it. Because I don't see them as two different things, that gnosis inspires art or that art inspires gnosis. I see them as like rivers downstream of a sort of a conceptual glacier that's feeding both, and so. And I think, like, I anthropologically, I am completely making this up without any background whatsoever, but I'm relatively certain.
Let it fly.
I'm relatively certain that that art has been something that humanity has always made. That you could describe that the artistic impulse, that desire to represent or comment upon or express our individual experience to others in a way that makes them have some kind of response, has been hardwired. It's part of how our brains are hardwired. I think our brains are, in a way, hardwired to want to connect, and to want to connect to a context or a level higher or more, without trying to add too many. I'm in a way, I'm sort of semantically trying to avoid like a lot of value statements here, so I'm trying to keep it relatively neutral. But this greater, in a sense of scale, level of consciousness or awareness, I think that we've been doing that since like before Homo sapiens were a thing. And so, like, to flip that around, I could say that arguably, if art and or the experience of art and gnosis are the same thing, or at least are two of the same directions to go from that glacier, then I would argue we've been doing it the whole time. And that, like, even if you scrubbed clean from society all of the references to Gnosticism as a religion, all of its history, all of its, like, the concepts that have been developed over the years, they would reemerge, because they wouldn't have gone away. They just wouldn't be even being described as the same thing.
That's a really fair point.
Yeah.
I was going to, and well said, by the way, and I was going to follow up with that I mentioned earlier as a definition, the subjective experience of objective spiritual reality, but gnosis has also been described, of course, as self-knowledge, self-awareness. The journey up is as much the journey in, as it were. So how do you think art plays into gnosis as a kind of process or acquaintanceship, I guess, with self-knowledge or self-awareness? The whole bit about know thyself, as it were.
Right. So I'm just going to close the window here because somebody's decided to do the weeding. There we go. I don't know how much of that came through the recording, but I just thought I'd take care of it.
It's all good.
Okay. So sorry, again, so the question was about as a vehicle for self-knowledge, you were saying?
Well, no, I mean, gnosis has also been described, with the old oracle phrase of know thyself, that as much as it's a process of the experience of the divine and the experience of the spiritual reality in existence, it's also a process of self-knowledge or self-awareness. So having that link between gnosis and art, how does art play into self-knowledge or self-awareness, I guess I would ask?
I think, again, it can't not. Like, it's sort of baked into what happens when art is made and then experienced, because through the process, like, I can say from going through a rehearsal process or a creative fiction writing process, I know for me, or when I'm writing comic books, I've dabbled in self-publishing some comics, is that there is an interior dialogue that happens creatively as you are making choices about what parts of the story to tell, what parts of the story you're not interested in, what parts of the story to emphasize, what questions the story is driving you to ask about the subject. All of that is a self-knowledge generator. Like, you will come through any artistic process knowing more about yourself than you did before. by the nature of the process, because you have to. You will learn more about your interests and more about your knowledge. At least I think you should. That's I think if you're making art and you know all of the answers before you go in, it might. To me, I think you're going to not get as far, or the impact you're going to have will only be as far as whatever you could imagine before you started. And I think, why stop there?
Indeed. I was gonna mention, I'm pretty crappy with my hands, so I don't have a lot of physically creative ability, but I do play guitar. I have played guitar for the last 25 years. Nowhere near as good as I should be, because church and work and life kind of pick away at my time. But the one thing I have discovered is that the longer I play guitar, the more I dislike Led Zeppelin. So there's a little bit of self-knowledge that the more I hear the sound I create, the more I either sympathize or appreciate with the music of other artists, and the more I discover the things I'm not interested in.
Well, and to caution you from rambling on there, sorry, couldn't go for
it. Never.
But and to continue on our stairway to heaven here.
Oh, please don't.
No, gentle listener, that there is a huge history of puns between me and Sean. But
it's all one way. He says them, and I'm subjected to them.
Yes, it is. It is definitely your subjective experience of my objective reality. But no. But even your story there about what you learn to appreciate artistically versus the more you create artistically, is one thing that I think is really valuable to point out there too. Is that not only do you perhaps know that you don't like Led Zeppelin even more so, but you probably have a way to articulate the why of it. That you like, it's not just like, I don't like the sound. You can actually say, like, I think you said in our chat a while ago that they're like, the rhythm is off, or the timing is off of a particular song, and that bothers you. And it's like,
I'm gonna get skewed by the Led Zeppelin fans that I know, but yeah, there's just some things that just haven't sat right with me. But I haven't kind of moved past the visceral dislike stage. I haven't spent a whole lot of time besides my initial reaction of, I don't see what the big deal is.
Right. But I think, like, just to push back on that a bit, when like you did articulate in the chat that there was like a particular song that was like out of time or something like that, it was like,
yeah, it always sound, the guitar parts in Black Dog always sound off to me.
Yeah. So, I mean, being able to say that, just like literally, that doesn't sound like a huge revelation, but that is self-knowledge there.
Indeed, and somebody's going to burn me at the stake for it. So, historically, there's a Gnosticism tie in there.
Yeah, exactly. There's where it's finding new heresies.
I'm always up for that.
So that's the self-knowledge for an artist creating. I think there is also a self-knowledge for the person receiving the art or experiencing it, and that self-knowledge can happen whether or not the artist intended it. One thing that what I was saying there before about is, like, most artists should, in my mind, be trying to engage with themselves and try not to have all the answers before they start. That they should want to explore ideas and explore the ideas that be in sort of self-dialogue with the art as they make it. But that art can also spur questions to the viewer in ways that the artist could not predict, but cause a reaction of a subjective experience out of objective reality that is no less true for the lack of intentionality that the artist had. It can be that the colors chosen for the costumes in a play are going to remind an audience member of a family member that passed away, that inspired them. Like, it can cause a trail of associations that is so profoundly specific and unique, and cannot be predicted, but are incredibly valid.
I'm tempted to throw in the term alchemical, kind of, when the art meets with another person, I guess, as it were.
Yeah. There is a melding, a melding of minds. The reason I'm so specifically saying that it's not that it's not connected to necessarily to an artist's intention is that I think it can be very tricky when an artist is attempting to enforce a particular type of mental shift. That it's like usually that's when people will tune out, because they'll be like, no, I don't. I see what you're selling and I don't want any. um, and I think the other thing too is that I think that like it's always best in my mind to leave as much room for that experience as possible versus only seeing that it can come through a particular vector.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So that, talking about taking that idea of a particular vector and channeling it into the next question, of course, I mentioned earlier on that we were going to separate Gnosis and Gnosticism. So looking at Gnosticism, I guess, as a particular vector, Demiurge, archons, the classical cosmology, the whole 9 yards of Gnosticism as a either a pre-Christian religion or perhaps a Christian heresy, depending on which historical viewpoint you take. How do you think Gnosticism in history interacts with art, as it were?
Right. Well, I think there's I would say the most obvious answer, or the most apparent answer is literally that like so much of art history is also like religious history and church history. Like a lot of the most famous paintings that we can think of and the most famous musics have come from people who were working within either a religious tradition or attempting to experience to present through art a religious idea or a religious image. So I think that's on its face. That's just a natural marriage of the two. Artists have always been engaged in a spiritual trajectory, often in a much more exoteric, like there is a church and it has a mythology and it has a mysticism around how things operate. And artists then use that framework and create art that represents something to do with that. So that's I think the obvious thing. I think as the more nuanced or perhaps the more, in my mind, like interesting, the more philosophical direction to go in is how much of artistic practice and Gnosticism as a religion, as a series of various religions that have now modern appeal, even though some of the ideas are very ancient, is often, I think, looking at them in my mind in artistic ways, like a lot of the emanation stuff that comes from different traditions is often like, I mean, there's a way of looking at that as an artistic process. Like you go from a vague idea to a finished product through a series of emanations. Like first you have the idea, then you have an outline for that idea. You have a way to, like a way to slightly frame the work in a particular area. Like I'm going to do a painting, or I'm going to do a play, or I'm going to do a story. I'm going to do a poem, and then continuing to kind of trim that down to the point where you've got something that you're actually showing someone else and trying to present it to them. I think the other thing too is that the great thing about Gnosticism and that bundle of traditions and histories that sort of sit underneath it is that it's honestly so rich and interesting and meaty in its drama and its stories that it cannot help but be fodder for artists to respond to it. Like as we were saying before, much earlier, about like things like The Matrix or Philip K. Dick as like really the main level. These are definitely Gnostic works, and then but a lot of other works that may are like either conceptually downstream or don't know that they're operating connected to that tradition, but are still like very obviously working with those that sort of almost like Jungian, Joseph Campbellian collective unconscious that they cannot help but continue to tell stories that operate in certain ways. Is that it's if Gnosis and art, I'll redefine that. If the experience of Gnosis and the experience of art are the same thing or are equal in my mind, then the Gnosticism, the traditions and downstream traditions of Gnosticism and artistic practice are continuously interweaving with each other. In some respects, art being inspired by those more defined, articulated mythologies and systems, and in others that there can be a connection in terms of process, how the art is made, how Gnosticism sees the experience of gnosis to be made.
I was going to say that I was listening to that, and when you were talking about the level of kind of one for one, and the interchange and the cosmology of Gnosticism, being a creative process, that the question light bulb went off in my head that if we were to make a more literal connection between the two, is a little bit of a tangent. Is there such a thing as heretical art? Right? If or art, perhaps because the stories found within classical Gnosticism, particularly the retelling or the shifted telling of the creation story we all know from the whole Judeo-Christian sphere, gets turned on its head in Gnosticism, and so Gnostic mythology tends to be acts of choice, acts of rebellion, acts of resistance, right? The acts of divergence. So, I guess is there such a thing perhaps as a kind of art orthodoxy, or can art be heretical?
Oh, I mean, yes, art can be incredibly heretical and orthodox. Like they both exist. In very many ways. Like I think like you could look at particular, say, like some of the much more classical art forms, or the art forms that have a very rigorous structure to them. Like I'm thinking here of say ballet, opera, orchestral music, particularly from like a particular corpus of composers. Even in theater, there are definitely styles of theater that have an orthodoxy in terms of their approach and what is considered to be, say, good, or if not good, at the very least, correct. Like this is what theater looks like, or this is what, say, fiction looks like. This is what poetry looks like. But then there are always heretics who are wanting to push those boundaries and want to create work that is tangentially connected to the earlier art forms, or is rebelling against those art forms. We talk about, say, orthodoxy and heresy. I think the one thing that is interesting maybe here, and this is if we're going to talk about, like I've been talking about all the ways that art and Gnosticism, or art and gnosis, are the same. One big enormous difference is that the artistic impulse was never so structured as to the point where you could say that there was an entire organization that could decide whether or not a type of art or a type of concept of art would be no longer valid, and from that point on heretical. Any of that sort of orthodoxy and heresy is much more of a received wisdom sense. Throughout the years, there has been like various people who've attempted to articulate what they think what good art is, or the best way to create it, or the best way to experience it. But there's never been an organization that could enforce the way a reader or audience member experiences it. They can suggest it. There can be, like, say, a canon of work through academia that says these are the best ways. These are the best books. You should read these books. They're the best ones. And they can attempt, but even again, that's still a subjective individual or group attempting to offer that. But there's never been essentially a small government or an empire that will enforce it that way. I mean, obviously, there's
not one that's lasted anyway. I can think of a few regimes who have attempted to kind of censor and do that kind of thing where art is concerned. And I mean, they even exist within living memory, right? But
Sure.
thankfully, none of them have survived, and people have that kind of ability to create, as it were.
Well, and I think like this goes back to what I was saying even there before about like, our Paleolithic ancestors who are making art and they can't help it, is that like, yeah, you might have a regime that is saying like, we're going to destroy all painting, or, we're going to, we're stopping fiction as of today. But you can't legislate what's inside someone's brain. You can't enforce, the way that like, you can't enforce the story somebody's going to tell their child at bedtime. Or at least at a certain point, the work of doing it has diminishing returns.
I'm going to say, you notice nobody ever comes along and says, we'd like to take Nickelback off the shelves. If you want evidence of the power of the archons, that might perhaps be it.
This is true. Yes, exactly. This is proof that we're living in the darkest timeline. No, what was I was going to say there about legislating? Well, and I think maybe interestingly though, as much as I was saying that difference is that like no one can call art heresy at an organizational level, but then I also made the point that like no one can legislate what's inside your mind. I think that like that is maybe the flip side of it too, is that like Gnosticism may have been at times a heresy. But that like, and in fact, ways in which Gnosticism survived was by attempting to like scrub clean all of its exoteric visible manifestations so that it looks as orthodox as possible. Because you can't legislate how the person is going to interpret it.
I was going to say, you also, talking about how you can't legislate the on the bad stuff. You can't legislate on the good stuff either.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that ultimately that restriction on the one hand becomes a freedom on the other hand.
Mm-hmm.
So if somehow in the last 46, 47 odd minutes it hasn't become obvious to folks, my follow-up question here is, where do you think Gnostics can benefit from art? And I feel like you've kind of been answering that question as we go. But if somebody came up to you specifically and said, I'm a Gnostic and I'm looking to and I'm looking to deepen my practice, how can art help me do that? Basically.
I think, it's one of the things that I would think, even just spawning from this conversation, is that notion of that dialogue between an artist and their work, and the dialogue between the audience and the work, which I will also note isn't necessarily a dialogue between the artist and the audience. That thing created in the middle becomes its own separate thing. Because I think, for those of you listening in the future, we're currently undergoing a global pandemic, which limits our access to be able to go out and do things. The reason I mention this is because the pandemic created an opportunity for Tarragon Theatre to put out a masterclass workshop with Daniel Brooks, who's an incredibly fine director who's created powerful theater. And listening to him talk about his process as director was very enlightening for me, in some respects, because he validated processes that I was already undergoing. And there was definitely that sense of like, oh, okay, my approach is valid because somebody I deeply respect is also doing the same thing. That's just a good feeling to get. But one of the things that he said, this is all getting to a point here, is that his thought is that one of the big things that a director should do is essentially be analytical with how they respond to things emotionally and intellectually, which is to say that like you're not necessarily being intellectual in your response, you're being intellectual about your response, or you're being analytical rather about your response. So to go back to your Led Zeppelin point, is that like to listen to Led Zeppelin, but then to analyze exactly why, to spend time thinking, why am I feeling this way about this thing? And I think that's something that I have found. I think that engagement of the question of why am I feeling this way is something that I know that it's driven a lot of our conversations about the AJC and the practices of the AJC and like why certain things are done in certain ways. And I think the more you engage with that question, the deeper your knowledge will be, your self-knowledge, as you were saying, the know thyself, the deeper that will go. And if you view your Gnosticism as much as an aesthetic experience as it is a religious experience, if you do not think that those are two separate things, then I think it frees you up to know that that's a question you can ask yourself without feeling like, am I doing Gnosticism wrong? You know?
So would it be fair to say, just to rewind 2 seconds, would it be fair to say that art helps you ask the questions of yourself that you didn't know you needed to ask?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I think there's a thought there too about the fact that the artistic process is one of continual development and engagement and change, and it's artists responding to their audience. It's artists like responding to how their audience takes in a work and then making new work based on that response. It's artists responding to themselves as they make work. Is that there's a very much a recursive loop in art that is, I think, something that is beneficial to anybody operating in a spiritual practice, to be continually recursive in their process. To see, like, for example, like one thing I'm fond of saying is that, like, I like to look at Gnostic mythology and religion almost as through the lens of textual analysis, like literary analysis, how writers respond to other writers. And like, there's like different kinds of analysis you can do in literature, like post-colonial analysis or postmodern analysis. The idea of the author is dead, where, like I was saying there before about it doesn't matter about the author's intention in something. And if you take those same questions but apply them to your Gnosticism or to your experience of, or your attempt to reach gnosis, I think, to me, it will only offer help. It will only offer more feedback into the loop of what you're bringing to your own spirituality,
which will then in turn emanate out to to bring it around.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that, I was going to say, that follows up that leads really well into the other question I had is, you're the artistic director of a theater company. So how have you worked, tried, succeeded, or failed any of those things to bring either gnosis or Gnosticism into your own work as an artistic director?
Yeah. So the easy out is simply that, going back to the thing I'm now really just like repeating over and over again, is that if I don't see gnosis and art as separate things, then by creating art, I am bringing gnosis. That's the easy answer. I would say I actually avoid trying to be overt or specific in my Gnosticism in the work that I make as a theater director.
You mean you don't have something on the wall that's like lion-headed with like snake feet and or rooster-headed or whatever, like Abraxas or the Demiurge or something up on the wall?
Well, hell, now I want that.
I would attend that.
Let's see. Maybe the next show. Yeah. So I would say, as an artist, I am striving for that deep, powerful connection. So that is my attempt to bring gnosis. Because if I can get my audience there, or if I can work on a project that helps get an audience member there, then I have provided that Gnostic experience, at least briefly, and maybe they don't become quote unquote Gnostics, but honestly, if they become more engaged members of society and perhaps more artistically minded in the sense that they either want to consume or create art, then again, if they are the same thing, then I feel like I am doing my job. That would be, I think that's probably the best way I could say that I've tried to bring Gnosis or Gnosticism to my work. I will say that there is, so I don't overtly bring Gnosis or Gnosticism to my work. I would say I do personally, individually bring those things to the to part of what I'm considering as I choose my work, or as I start to congeal an idea into a story. I would say that there is maybe a like, not like I'm going to adapt this particular Gnostic myth into a story. It's not like that, but it is part of the various ingredients, the various flavors that I'm putting into any work that I'm making. That spiritual connection I have to the power of narrative to affect individuals is to me also very connected to my experience of Gnosticism. So I would say that is maybe a direct choice versus the other one, which was maybe slightly more indirect or more general.
So you've talked about here particularly, Gnosis as a part of the creation of art and how that kind of personally influences your work, but you're also a consumer of art. Mm-hmm. And so naturally, because everything like this, particularly when talking about Gnosticism, needs to have a pop culture thing, or perhaps an anti-pop culture thing, whatever that means. What are the works of art in any format that you've currently or recently consumed that's really got the kind of juice of Gnosticism flowing? In other words, what has been on Jason's Gnostic reading table or TV screen or earbuds, as it were? What is something that really kicked that up for you recently?
That's a good question. So a couple of things. One of the first impulses I have is simply to talk about, there's this really beautiful comic called, it only had, I think, I want to say 14 issues, I think. And then it's been on a hiatus that is now maybe permanent. I don't know, but it's called ODY-C, or Odyssey. And it is a extreme science fiction gender bent version of the Odyssey. So instead of Odysseus, it's Odyssea. She is a spaceship captain trying to get back home from a cosmic war that she's been fighting. And the person who wrote it, Matt Fraction, was very intentional in trying to adapt as much, like being as aware as he could be of the actual Greek myth that he was using, and even the Greek meter, the way that the rhyme structure and the verse structure of the Odyssey is something that he tried to imitate in his writing as well. So that created this fantastic conceptual landscape for my brain to play in as I read the story. The art by Christian Ward is fantastic. It's colorful. It's rich. I heard one person describe it as almost too good, because then you almost have to slow down to both read the story and consume the art, but in a way that I think that only draws you deeper into the story and the characters and the concepts that are in play.
Well, I was going to say there's a thing that I heard, and I can't remember where I heard it. It was probably decades ago, that in relation to music, but I think it applies here, is that good music hits you in one of three places: the head, the heart, or the groin. And great music will do all three. Exactly. So I think it's entirely possible that you can get that kind of story and narrative thing, and on a concurrent, parallel, powerful channel, have the art, the artistry, particularly with this comic, be worthy of its own time.
Oh yeah, and the places that this story goes, to me, again, I don't believe that Matt Fraction or Christian Ward were attempting to explicate any kind of Gnostic or religious or spiritual truth that I'm aware of. But there was the nature of like these characters that are going through deep, profound, tragic lives that he's adapting from known tragedies that we're aware of. But also the interplay of these divine figures, because the gods exist in this comic as well. They're the Zeus and Hera and Poseidon are all there. But the way they interact with the humans in the story is so interesting and fraught and compelling. And there was one particular moment where I'm paraphrasing this, but like where a one of the ship captains, like one of Odysseus' like fellow ship captains, is out on her own trip, and she gets captured by essentially a god, and the god is asking her these questions, and at one point it says to her, "You think that we are your puppet masters, but we're not. There is no puppetry. We're your mirrors." And that concept just like hit me between the eyes, and I had to put down the comic for probably about 10 minutes and just think about that. And even as I say that idea bomb now, I can't say that I fully know what it means, that I have a spiritual discovery that I could articulate, so much as there is this incredible impact that has a conceptual blast radius that I am still sorting through the the shrapnel of, and trying to sort of reassemble into this new thing after the impact of that idea. So that to me was like that's been some of my pandemic reading was going back and reading the Odyssey. I read it when it came out, issue by issue, and then now I read through it all just recently and was profoundly moved by it.
I'm a big fan of binging things, so
yes, I know.
You can tell I've never missed a meal. So
another piece, and I'll be a little coy about it because there's hopefully another project that we'll get going here soon that we'll go deeper into it. But I watched the movie Battle Angel Alita recently, and with that one, I think, again, that notion of I doubt it's intentional, but there are some fascinating parallels between like actual Gnostic cosmology and the story of the film. Like you've got this powerful feminine figure who is like literally falls from the sky, falls from heaven, has no memory of herself, and like engages with the world, falls in love with the world, wants to protect it from controlling forces that are trying to limit and restrict everyone in that world. And in so doing inspires those around her to be better. That's pretty damn Gnostic. at least I felt so.
It sounds pretty damn Sophia.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I remember watching the film in the theater and just having this, like, going back to those aha moments is like, I'm like, oh my God, that's what that is. Like, and like, I don't know. I mean, I haven't done my research. Maybe, maybe the comic book creators, because it comes from an old Japanese manga called Battle Angel Alita. I actually think it's there's other names for it. I won't get into the full history there, but I don't know if those creators or if Robert Rodriguez or what's his name, the guy who did the Terminator movies. Oh shoot,
Cameron.
Yeah. If they had, like, if they were intentionally saying, yes, this is a recognition of the Sophia myth, I doubt it. I really doubt it. I'd be fascinated if that were true. But
if all of that is, I mean, if all of that is intentional, that's something worthy of its own remark. But I think if all of that's unintentional and it still comes through, it's equally worthy, because that goes back to about the halfway point, in our conversation, talking about whether or not art has the power to hit the underground stream, as it were, and tap into something without necessarily a physical or intentional connection between
exactly. Yeah, entirely. So yeah, those would be probably the two ones that I'm that I would most directly point to. The one other thing I would maybe just point at is that like I don't know if this happens to everybody, but I know for me, when I watch particularly strong fiction or like movies or TV or books, what have you, uh, um, that I can often be inspired by the characters in those stories, and in some respects start to think of ways I can internalize those characters into myself to help me better myself, to be a little more, you know, to be like a little more noble or a little more patient or a little more intellectual or what have you, like to take on these ideas. And I think that's sort of like a
Like
low.
I was going to say, like a fictional take on kind of the esoteric or Western mystery tradition practice of assumption of the God forms, essentially, in invoking a being in order to embody their qualities, as it were.
Yeah, I would say definitely like a low level version of that is something that I think is maybe points to the level of power that art can have to move someone and to change them, even if it's briefly. Maybe you're only inspired for the day or for the week, or maybe it's a lifetime of change that because of that, like what you learned about that one character. Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. I definitely, listening and discussing all that, it definitely makes me realize that I don't create enough. My guitar has been gathering dust. Uh, so I definitely want to, I spend a lot of my time reading and writing things related to seminary. So it's a pretty narrow band. And so I don't often get the opportunity, or when I have it, I'm too tired to take the opportunity to kind of branch out and I guess see the world under different eyes that way. But definitely, it has lit a little bit of a fire on my own end. So hopefully, I can dig into that. We just hit about the hour and 6 mark, so I was going to wrap it up a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think we've covered a lot of ground. We've retreaded some ground with a lot of clear tracks as well in some parts. But it's entirely possible there's something that we didn't cover. So and certainly as folks listen to this, they may have their own questions or thoughts on it that may inspire us to do a follow up. But in the immediate, is there a thought that you have on the broader topic of gnosis and art, or Gnosticism and art, or the practice of creation that we haven't covered here, that you think other people should hear as they embark on their own art and expression?
Definitely. Yeah. One thought that I was having was that, and this is different for different cultures, so it's not a 100% always true thing, but despite the prevalence of art, there is often, I think, a devaluing of art. We see art as a nice to have, as a luxury, not necessarily as a necessity. Even though we can't help but turn everything we do into a narrative of some kind. And so I think the one thing I would maybe caution, and probably if you've listened to this much of the episode, you're probably already on board, so this might not need saying, but that to not think that, to not necessarily think that to call religion or spirituality an artistic practice that does not reduce the definition of spiritualism at all. What it does is, I think, it elevates the importance of art. Art is not a sort of a frippery that we just put, that we can attach ourselves to when we feel, when things are nice and cozy. It is a vital way of engaging with your own soul.
I think it's also possible, I mean, that it functionally expands both definitions rather than taking one down to the level of the other. I don't think I think in many people's worlds, they exist on different planes. So of course there's opportunity experientially to link the two together, but there's also an opportunity to heighten or expand the definition of the other in light of the other, I guess, as it were.
100%. Yeah. And I think I mentioned it because I think there can sometimes be an assumption that like artists are these like, bohemians living over here, just like sleeping in all day and like eventually throwing some paint on a canvas sometimes and having more parties. And that has been a part of art for a long time. So, that image does exist, but that but that the work and what's happening is not, like that. It's not to not let that image be what you assume art has to be or how an artistic process has to be.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I hope you enjoyed chatting as much as I enjoyed chatting, and more that I enjoyed listening. I don't think anybody's ever heard me shut up for this long. So that's an exercise in spirituality and asceticism and art all of its own. So I think if people enjoy some of our riffing here, we might have to do it again.
Oh, that would be great. I would love that.
Excellent. So, in the meantime, in between time and all that stuff, I guess you and I will encounter each other in all the usual places, which in a pandemic scenario, I hope it means that this ends sooner rather than later with the safety and health and sanity of all involved, and we can again break bread in person.
100%. Looking forward to it.
Well, I will catch you then. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciated this. Thanks for letting me speak to you and just run with these ideas.
It was my enjoyment. Catch you soon.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.